It's always been my impression that the Chinese authorities have been very, very fearful of inflation because that really has a big impact on the standards of living of people within China. They could allow the currency to revalue more rapidly to help offset the rising inflation that we're seeing in China. Is that likely to provide the incentive for the authorities to loosen this peg and start appreciating the currency much more rapidly?
Well, it's a very good point. I think they just don't actually have the growth engine internally at the moment, and also they're not an autarkic nation. They need to accumulate a lot of goods, and they obviously want to procure those easily in time, and obviously allowing the currency to rise. That probably be advantageous. But at this point, the accumulation of reserves they have, because of a weaker currency, actually perversely has allowed them to hoard a lot of real assets, which they need for infrastructure build, which we've seen to a large extent in the last 10 years.
Yeah, but a lot of that infrastructure build has been bad investment. From what I understand, a lot of it's been wasted, built on things that have not been economically productive. We hear the stories about empty cities, waiting for some, future occupants to occupy them. So is a lot of that money in accumulation of capital has been wasted?
Well, again, you bring up an interesting point. I'm definitely not schooled enough to be a Chinese expert. I've traveled there, I would consider extensively, but in order to really understand the country, and it's so vast, you have to spend, I think, many years in that country. And I don't think a few weeks here every year really counts. But I think you'll have those who say that there's been a huge misallocation of capital, that there's huge white elephants, and that actually the speed of growth of some of the infrastructure. We just saw a Chinese train, one of the bullet trains, had an accident, and everyone immediately starts saying, "Oh, they're Chinese buildings. It's of poor quality." I always remember the analogy of my work partner who said had a spanner that he was using his house on some DIY, and he broke it working on a radiator, and his father, who was helping him, pulled out of his bag, he pulled out this steel from a steel spanner from the trenches, would you believe, and said, "This was your grandfather's, this is British steel, and this won't break." And sure enough, and that's all about utility value. They've created a lot of goods at very cheap value. To actually answer your question, I'm undecided on that, and I think that it pays a lot to give more attention to what's actually going on within their financial system. But it's so opaque. We're not really sure how much of the loans, how much of them are already starting to go wrong already. Mm-hmm. But one thing is I'm very sure of, that this infrastructure build hasn't ended, because there are 200 million plus people still needing to move into the urban environment. And that's going to need a lot of resources, and they have deficits in that regard. They need copper, they need iron ore. It's going to tail off. The rate of growth will not be the same. But those who are, I think, calling for an impending doom in China, I would probably say that they will be able to manage that deflation, if that's the right word.
Do you see China going back to some kind of a gold standard? They've been an accumulator of precious metals. They still have a relatively small amount compared to the total value of the reserves. But do you think they'll eventually impose the discipline of gold on their money creation?
I think they are making a very tacit move to do that. I do believe that from my experience with dealing with state government there, in terms of the central banks. In my former life, I was a head of bond trading in London for US government bonds, and we were the #1 dealer for the PBOC and SAFE. And I was very impressed with their knowledge. They, in fact, I always remember a particular lady there had a book of Hayek on her desk. And these are very intelligent, well-schooled individuals about the capitalist system. I think they fully understand that a sound monetary system predicated on a physical asset such as gold is the way forward. But I think they're doing it in a very clever way, which is they're encouraging, and it doesn't take much encouragement because they have a natural affinity, their population, but savings in that country is taking place through now deposit accounts at banks backed by gold. So I think they would be able to put their currency in such a situation to have a gold backing, because the populace already owns gold, so it will already be in the hand as a medium of exchange. And just to say one last thing about that, China perhaps have more reserves in gold than we already know. I think,
yeah, I'm a believer of that.
It's
yeah.
a command economy. It's no coincidence they came out and said, oh, actually we had a little bit more, a bit like the Saudis said, oh, we found a few hundred tons more.
Yeah, no, I believe they've been accumulating a lot more than they announced. But when it's politically advantageous for them, or they deem it to be politically advantageous, they announce an increase in reserves. I think this last one was the third one that they announced in this past decade of increase in the gold reserves. But I want to tie it back to how we started this conversation about the problems and deficiencies and the imbalances in Bretton Woods II, which is our current monetary system. You're basically saying the Chinese understand how the current monetary system is broken, and they're not going to rock the boat, but they're going to continue to take advantage of it as well as they can in order to raise the standards of living of the Chinese population.
Absolutely. I think that's absolutely where they're heading. They're not God. They can't move the Titanic, the boat, that quickly unless they obviously hit an iceberg. Which comes back to the non-performing loans. Is there a hidden iceberg there in China? And will it ever come to light? Because again, it's a command economy, and you can obfuscate to hell and back, and no one's ever going to know. Will that misallocation of capital that some people believe has occurred? I think that it will not. Any problems that occur in China, a slowdown, yes, they can start cutting rates. I mean, they've already raised rates, ratcheted rates, as a way of sterilizing all this FX accumulation they had of late. So I think they have a lot of powder. Unfortunately, it's the laws of diminishing returns. Every time that they have a fiscal spend or they open up the monetary spigot, actually they're not really getting much return on their capital. They were just as guilty as anyone else in the 2008 crisis of having a huge fiscal boom. Fiscal spending boom, and they didn't get much bang for their buck, but they got through.
And the bottom line is every time the Federal Reserve turns to the printing press, call it quantitative easing or printing money or whatever you want, because the dollar is the world's reserve currency of the world, some of those dollars are going to end up in China and cause inflation domestically.
Yeah, absolutely. And the rest of Asia,